Hello, my friends. Thanks again for joining me. I'm old Dr. D, and this is part 3, Perspectives on Life, Trauma and Grief. So reflecting on why we don't speak. The most important things are the hardest things to say. They're the things you get ashamed of because words diminish them. Words shrink things that seemed limitless when they were in your head to no more than living size when they were brought out. But it's more than that, isn't it? The most important things lie too close to wherever your secret heart is buried, like landmarks to a treasure your enemies would love to steal away. And you may make revelations that cost you dearly, only to have people look at you in a funny way, not understanding what you've said at all, or why you thought it was so important that you almost cried while you were saying it. That's the worst, I think. When a secret stays locked within, not for the want of a teller, but for the want of a listening ear. So that quote is from Stephen King. The most important things are the hardest things to say. At the same time, though, we can learn to speak. So Audre Lorde shared this idea after contemplating the nature of racism and sexism and other isms that cause such loss and such trauma for people. She said, "I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. That speaking profits me beyond any other effect. We can learn to work and speak when we are afraid in the same way we have learned to work and speak when we are tired. For we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. The fact that I am here and I speak these words is an attempt to break the silence and bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. For those of you suffering grief, for those of you suffering trauma, you have learned to feel afraid because of how often your words have been bruised and misunderstood. So therefore, I am sorry that your fear is justified and your silence a shield from any further bruising. At the same time, though, that silence is immobilizing. It keeps us stuck. And for those of us suffering grief, there are so many silences to be broken. When I'm talking to my students, some of them come up to me after class and say, "You know, Dr. D, I'd love to be a therapist, but I'm just too empathic. Like when people talk, I just feel what they're saying very deeply and I get where they're coming from. And sometimes I can even finish their sentences or their paragraph sentences before they've even stopped speaking. I know where this is going and I feel it very deeply and I want to help. I want to help." And I chuckle to myself. I do not chuckle out loud because I don't want to hurt their feelings. That's like, imagine a pre-med professor. A student comes in and says, "You know, I have this precise knowledge of neuroanatomy, incredibly precise hand-eye coordination, and a desire to help, but I'm just too good at it. I couldn't help." That's how I feel when students come in and say, "I'm too empathic. I couldn't possibly be a therapist." No, you could be, and you could probably be really good. One of the things that I would like you to reflect on, I tell these students, is the I in I want to help. One of the things that we get to do is to let go of expectation. One of the most healing things those of us who have suffered trauma and grief have encountered is the acceptance, warm and loving acceptance of other people, of our suffering. That there is no demand on their part, tacit or explicit, that we not hurt, that we not have our world tilted, but instead that we be different than we are. And that is very powerful, the face of that acceptance. the love, the tears, the hug. Tears of compassion rather than tears of shared sorrow. A hug of support rather than a hug of, please stop crying. One of my favorite thinkers, fellow Benjamin Mikhail Bakhtin, did his best work behind the Iron Curtain. And in my opinion, some of his work he did in the gulags was some of the most impressive. He was persecuted because he refused to renounce his Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And that kind of integrity I admire. One of the things he asks, though, having read some works in psychology, he says, psychologists say that empathy is feeling what the other person feels. And therefore, if you're in a role of helper and somebody comes and they're crying to you with despair and you feeling what they feel, you cry in despair as well. Who then is helping? He says, perhaps another way of understanding empathy is that when you encounter the suffering of another, that you acknowledge your own desire to help them. That when they cry in despair, your tears are ones of warmth and care, not of despair of your own. To remove the I and I want to help, and instead put in the thou of what dost thou need. This compassion that Bakhtin is talking about, I've encountered again and again, is hard work, but it is not a burden. And what I mean by that is when somebody is coming to you and they're grieving and they're heartbroken and they're, that heart is shattered before they've begun to use the gold epoxy of love to glue their heart back together, kintsugiria being that it is hard work to provide space for the radical acceptance of the suffering of another. Because we want things to be okay. It is an important, natural desire that we have to instead radically provide space for the suffering of another. It can be like us putting our hands in the ocean and parting the Pacific just with the will of our hearts that they can have space to be. And that kind of focus, that kind of deep listening requires a lot of love, a lot of care, a lot of concentration, a lot of energy. So therefore, after a long day of hearing stories of heartache and trauma, that it is understandable and even important that we go home tired to our quiet rooms. For me, I've got a music room where speakers and headphones and music, and I retreat into that space because I am tired. But I am not burdened. Compassion is not a burden because we do not carry other people with us. There's this simple technique in Buddhist philosophy that when you find yourself thinking of another who is not there, and it is causing you emotional distress as you're thinking about someone that's not there, you are just draining yourself, and it does nothing for them because they are not here. That you get to, when the other person leaves, to let them go and not carry them with you. Like, I've had different of my colleagues and supervisors through the years talk about this in various different ways. One of my supervisors, she talked about how it is that when she drives away from work, she's a deeply religious woman. When she drives away from work, she says a prayer to her God. And she thinks of every one of the people who have touched her life that day. And she thanks God for them. And then when she thanks God for a given individual, she gives that person back to God until they see each other again. Likewise, another colleague of mine talks about the loving universe. His philosophy is informed more by a Buddhist philosophy where he is the manifestation of the care of the universe for a person when he is around, that he gets to be the face of care that the universe can have for various people. And when he can no longer see their face, he is hoping that the universe is looking at them in different caring ways, that they are out of the reach of his arm, and therefore they are now in the reach of others. And he gives them back to the universe very meditatively, very intentionally. The universe will care for them until he gets to behold them again. Likewise, I've still had other friends, family, colleagues talk about reassuring themselves that after somebody they care about who is still in sorrow, who's still in trauma, that when they leave, that there will be other caring people, and that they do not need to be the only caring person. There is a theme that I have in my teaching and my training, and that is do not remain the only one helping. If there was somebody truly suffering and truly in sorrow, that other people get to be involved, and it's very important that they be. So there is a big secret about coping with grief, as I've done extensive reading on the subject in my own decades of clinical work on the matter. The secret about coping with grief is that we grieve together. You know, in the Western Christian tradition, they talk about mourning with those who mourn. That does not necessarily mean that they have suffered a loss and you have not suffered the same loss. Therefore, you need to pretend to yourself that you have suffered the same loss as them. But instead, to be there in the face of mourning as a comforting person, that when somebody is in that state, that you are there supporting with them. Be in the place of mourning with those who are actively mourning. We grieve together. So as I was thinking about this, like, how do you go about this? Be as warm water. Take the shape of a conversation and fill it with compassion. Empathize and validate. Show this compassion actively. Only offer advice when asked, and be prepared to have your advice rejected. Try not to take it personally. Have a sense of humor about it. Tease gently. Historically, some believe that the devil, a fallen angel, comes through the corners, never directly through the door of our souls. Kind angels, when they want to be heard, do the same. When they appear, obviously, people run or resist. But when they come through the corners, they can exert a graceful influence, sometimes not felt until later. You get to be one of those angels for others. You get to come at them sideways. Never directly, you need to feel better, you're broken, you need to be fixed, here's our treatment plans, here's what we need to do, you're wrong, you need to be healthy again. Instead, we come into the corners by doing things as simple as listening. Responding, reflecting to somebody, back to them what we're hearing, asking them open-ended questions. Endeavoring to let go of our assumptions about what should, must, and not be, and instead endeavoring acceptance for the horrible reality for what is. That our tears are shed as kindness and connection, not tears of our own grief. Let go of the assumption that crying is bad, or always an indication that something is wrong. Tears can be an indication that something is very, very right. So when you do this work, when you are in the place of comforting other people, or sitting in sorrow with them, it reminds me of this quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So she was the one that did research on grief some years ago. She was the one that modeled, the DABDA model, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Can't remember the order, but those are the elements of it. And after some years of doing this research, she wrote the following. The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and deep loving concern. In essence, beautiful people do not just happen. That is one of the tragedies that I have found, is that some of the kindest and most compassionate people I know are those that have suffered the worst. And they have found their way out of the depths. But they never lose sight of it. And they know when others have drowned in the cold, crushing depths of grief and are learning to breathe water. This from McKierney. What we can do, other than try to remind one another that some things can't be fixed and not all wounds are meant to heal. We need each other to remember, to help each other remember, that grief is multitasking emotion. Back to my colleague who recently lost a child. He's trying to finish up medical school. And now he is left to multitask medical school, his surviving child, his wife, his friends. That he now gets to multitask emotion. The grief is always there by varying degrees. And so therefore we can endeavor patience with others who are multitasking. So this from Do Hyun Cho. Stillness is what creates love. Movement is what creates life. To be still and still moving is everything. Stillness is what creates love. Movement is what creates life. To be still and still moving is everything. Stillness creates love because we quit moving, quit demanding that another be otherwise than what they are. Our soul is still and radically accepting as far as they are concerned. Movement is what creates life, from the very molecular processes within ourselves to the movements of our hearts and our bodies, likewise moving with other people. To be still in love and still moving in life is everything. Likewise, mourn with those who mourn, as we mentioned, means sitting still in the face of grief. To be still with others, to hold them when they need us to be still with them, where we do not demand or attach an outcome to them. And yet, still moving to live. There is a tragedy, I think, in every clam and every oyster, and that is pearls are born of harm. The sharp little piece of sand in the very tender tissues of that particular creature, tearing, irritating. So the creature layers upon layers of mucosa that hardens until it forms something beautiful, but you notice the layers keep mounting because it is painful to have something stuck like that. And yet other people get to appreciate the pearls of our suffering. So, a poem in closing today, or at least this episode. It's reflecting on what happened, the loss of one of my own children. As he lay dying, I slipped down my exhaustion into turbid slumber and dreamt again. Climbing a mountain as tall as life is long, no trails or marked paths, only indifferent and treacherous slopes. Scrambling up razor-sharp shale, I slipped again and fell against the rocks, shredding my clothes and lacerating my skin. Helplessness gave way to anger, then to tears, and after another painful fall, I lay on my back bleeding, exhausted and demoralized. Silhouetted by the sun, someone leaned over me and with a gentle voice like distant thunder said, "This hurts. Oh, how I know how this hurts. When you are ready, please let me help you up and we will climb together." Reluctantly, I allowed him to help me up, and to my surprise, we walked along the mountain rather than climbing and met many others along the way, some hurting, some climbing, some resting, yet all on the mountain. I wondered then what might merit the climb, and thought surely the pinnacle must be worth the agony. In my mind's eye, I withdrew from my place on the slopes and flew to the jagged peaks at the top. There I saw exhausted souls collapse joyfully as they rested, and they looked around and embraced others. Soon, however, their gaze would descend the mountain to the struggling souls below. Most, pulled by their compassion, slowly descended. I wondered then about God. If there was a God, surely he would be worth the agony of the climb. And my gaze lingered on the highest peak above the clouds. Startled, I beheld the throne empty and felt angry at his absence. He did not pull his children up to him. All of the children he professed to love struggled painfully on the mountain. Then my vision beheld the whole of the eternal mountain, and humbled, I realized the truth. God dwelt everywhere, one soul said to another. This hurts. Oh, how I know how much this hurts. When you are ready, let me help you up, and we will climb together. I awoke to the pained moans of my son, and massaged his aching bones so he could sleep once more. Thank you for hanging out with me for a minute. I'm old Dr. D, and that's my perspectives on trauma and grief.